They had swept the Pacific with a speed and confidence that seemed unstoppable. Cities, fleets, islands fell in a matter of months, and the map of Japanese control grew darker by the week. Then, in the gray hours before dawn on April 18, 1942, 16 medium bombers roared off the deck of an American aircraft carrier and flew toward the heart of the Japanese Empire. They did not sink a fleet. They did not topple emperors. They simply dropped their loads over Tokyo and a handful of other targets, then struggled to reach friendly airfields thousands of miles away. The physical damage was limited. The political and psychological shock was not. This small, audacious operation, led by Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle and launched from the USS Hornet, did something far greater than destruction. It punctured an illusion. It told the Japanese leadership that the American fleet could reach their home islands. It told the Japanese public, briefly and brutally, that their imperial project was not invulnerable. For Tokyo and for Isoroku Yamamoto, the raid was a wake-up call. It did not cause the course of the war by itself, but it altered perceptions, forced choices, and accelerated decisions already simmering in Japanese strategy rooms. Those choices, taken under the pressure of wounded prestige and the need to reassert dominance, set in motion a series of operations that would bring the Pacific to a new, hotter center: the Solomons, Guadalcanal, Tulagi, Gavutu, Tanambogo. There, American resilience and a painful learning curve would begin to blunt, then roll back Japanese momentum. To understand how a dozen bombers over Tokyo rippled across vast oceans and led commanders thousands of miles away to gamble everything, we have to see the war in both scopes at once: the high table of admirals and ministers shaping grand strategy, and the sand and jungle struggle of units on beaches and in caves that would test every assumption. The Doolittle Raid is the spine of this story, a catalytic psychological event, and the campaign that follows is the body that reveals its consequences: the decisions, the misreads, the courage, and the terrible costs. If you want the full chain of events, how Coral Sea and Midway fit into the reaction, how intelligence wins and misses shaped choices, and how Guadalcanal became a crucible of adaptation, stay with us through this series. In early 1942, the Imperial Japanese Navy rode high. Months after Pearl Harbor, Japan appeared to have seized the initiative. In the minds of many in Tokyo and in strategic circles in Japan's fleet, the empire was still in a trajectory of expansion that might be converted, if timed and negotiated correctly, into a favorable peace. Isoroku Yamamoto, whose air and carrier doctrine had helped modernize Japan's striking forces, understood both the reach and the limitations of that power. He was a strategist tempered by experience. He had traveled abroad and seen the magnitude of American industrial potential.
Privately, he warned that Japan might have only a limited window in which to secure territorial advantages before facing the full weight of American recovery. That awareness, an uneasy mix of confidence and caution, shaped the debates that followed the raid on Tokyo. Those debates were not uniform. In the months after December 1941, factions within Japan's government and military argued over the next steps. Some pushed for expansion, seizing territories and strengthening resource lines. Others advocated consolidation, fortify, wait, and bargain. The naval staff, confident in carrier aviation and fleet action, moved toward operations that would draw American carriers into decisive fights. The idea of a sweeping sailors' victory, a crushing engagement that would eliminate the U.S. carrier threat, began to take precedence. Then came the embarrassment of the Doolittle Raid. It was not the material cost that stung Japan so much as the symbolic blow. The enemy could strike the home islands, an affront to prestige in a culture where honor and face mattered deeply. Public reaction in Japan swung between fury and disbelief. The military reaction was strategic and practical. Prestige had to be restored, deterrence reasserted, and the perceived threat neutralized. For naval planners who already favored a bold solution, that argument became easier to press. If American carriers could reach Japan, one way to remove that threat was to force a decisive, annihilating battle that would cripple the U.S. naval air arm. Yamamoto's plan, already under consideration, took on a sharper edge in that atmosphere. He argued for drawing out and destroying American carriers through a feint that would bait them into a location of Japan's choosing. Midway Atoll, small and remote, became that graveyard of opportunity in Japanese calculations. If American carriers were lured into a trap near Midway, Japanese battleships and carriers could smash them and regain operational dominance. The Doolittle Raid did not create Yamamoto's plan, but it galvanized the urgency behind it. The raid fed into a set of motives: prestige, security, and the desire for a decisive engagement that pushed Tokyo toward taking greater risks. Across the Pacific, American commanders were beginning to grasp a different reality. The Navy and the War Department faced stark material constraints. Carriers were few, trained air crews were scarce, and logistical chains stretched shorter and thinner than strategy required. Yet public and political pressure demanded action. The Doolittle Raid had demonstrated American resolve and shocked American morale in an almost opposite way, showing that boldness, even in constraint, could strike fear into the enemy.
American strategy began to balance two aims: to blunt Japanese offensives, particularly any thrust toward Australia that could sever Allied lines in the Southwest Pacific, and to seek opportunities to erode Japanese offensive capacity through carrier engagements and attrition. At the center of Allied strategic friction were personalities and competing theaters. Admiral Ernest J. King in Washington, D.C., carried a blunt, centralizing view of naval operations and wanted an aggressive posture. In the Pacific, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, managed the carrier forces and island defenses in the Central Pacific. General Douglas MacArthur, responsible for the Southwest Pacific area, pressed for priority in the effort to stem Japanese advances toward Australia and retake lost ground. In the South Pacific, command arrangements were tangled further by ambiguity. Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley, commander of the Southwest Pacific area, operated with concern and caution. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher commanded carrier task forces, whose protection of invasion forces, then experimental, was still an evolving art. On the amphibious side, Rear Admiral Richmond K. Turner was developing techniques for launching and supporting seaborne landings on coral reefs, beaches, and fortified islets. The result was not outright disunity, but a fragile pluralism. Several strong leaders with overlapping responsibilities, constrained resources, and different tolerances for risk. Those tensions mattered on the decks and on the charts. Amphibious doctrine was not yet mature in 1942. The American military had limited experience mounting large-scale combined operations in the kind of environment the Solomons presented: a tangle of reef, jungle, narrow sea lanes, and dispersed Japanese outposts. The logistical chain, troops, landing craft, ammunition, fuel, was delicate. The schedule for the operation that would strike at Guadalcanal was compressed. Intelligence hinted at opportunities and concealed dangers in equal measure. Intelligence, for its part, was a tangle of triumph and failure. American codebreakers, operating in Washington and through Nimitz's cryptanalytic network, had begun to pluck threads from Japanese communications. Radio traffic analysis and decrypts offered glimpses of Japanese intentions, and they would prove decisive at crucial moments. At the same time, the vastness of the ocean and the difficulty of keeping eyes on every approach left dangerous gaps. The Slot, a deep-water channel running northwest-southeast between the islands of the Solomons, was a route Japanese ships used to move forces under cover of darkness. Coast watchers, small teams of Allied observers stationed on outlying islands, provided invaluable localized warnings of Japanese movement along those routes. Their reports were often the difference between ambush and surprise. Yet gaps in reconnaissance, the fog of war, and stretched searching capabilities meant that sometimes a planned screening left openings. Searches could fail or be misdirected, and those misses could have immediate, deadly consequences. The Doolittle Raid amplified the urgency of all this. Faced with a shaken public and a leadership demanding action, the Japanese sought to expand and solidify perimeter defenses, particularly in areas that threatened their newly acquired lines of communication to the south. The Solomons, and Guadalcanal in particular, loomed as linchpins for control of sea lanes to Australia and the Allied flank. On the American side, planners considered a proactive strike at the airfield under construction on Guadalcanal, later to be named Henderson Field by Allied forces. An American presence there would threaten Japanese moves and protect the exposed sea lanes linking the United States to Australia. Operationally, the plan to seize Guadalcanal was bold but imperfectly resourced. The invasion group would be small by later standards and had to rely on carriers to provide initial air cover until the captured airfield could host fighters and bombers. That reliance put carriers in the vulnerable position of being near shore, within range of land-based Japanese aircraft from nearby strongholds like Rabaul and the Shortland Islands. The carriers could not remain indefinitely, and they could not be risked recklessly. Yet leaving them too soon would expose the invasion force to counterattack. This was the paradox commanders faced. Protect the beachhead with the assets you cannot afford to lose. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, the mood hardened. Japanese naval staffs pressed to eliminate the carrier threat with a decisive fleet action. The Doolittle Raid had underscored that American strike capability, however limited, could inflict political damage. That urgency fed the planning that culminated at Midway, an operation intended to lure and destroy U.S. carriers. American codebreakers, however, had by then begun to piece together enough of Japan's communications to suspect Midway was a target. That cryptolytic success would alter the balance at Midway, a full and heavily consequential meeting of naval air power. Coral Sea, earlier in May, had already demonstrated that carrier versus carrier battles would no longer be fought on the decks of battleships but in the air above. Both battles, and the intelligence that influenced them, belonged to the chain of events that flowed from the psychological shock of the raid. On small islands and at sea, human stories threaded the larger strategy. Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle's crews endured desperate fuel calculations, forced landings in China, and the risk of capture. Coast watchers, often single men or tiny teams, scrounged sightings by candlelight and radioed warnings under the threat of Japanese patrols.
On Guadalcanal and the adjacent islets, units prepared for landings into a terrain they knew only from aerial photos and hurried briefings. Amphibious commanders rehearsed landing sequences that combined destroyers, transports, and improvised landing craft, each vulnerable to reefs and enemy fire. Sailors and Marines loaded with gear and expectation would soon find a new kind of combat: short, brutal engagements in mangrove swamps, cave clearing under machine gun fire, and the peculiar terror of close-range naval gunfire and air attack. It is important here not to confuse causation with consequence. The Doolittle Raid did not single-handedly decide policy. Rather, it pressed on an already strained set of choices. It hardened resolve in Tokyo, gave sway to voices that called for bold, corrective action, and provided a psychological impetus to execute a plan that might otherwise have been postponed or more cautiously pursued. In the U.S. command, the raid bolstered the conviction that daring, combined with intelligence and decisive action, could yield leverage out of scarcity. That conviction, however, was tempered by practical reality. The United States, at that moment, still did not possess an unlimited number of modern carriers or perfectly trained amphibious forces. The result was a series of calculated risks on both sides. When the Allied fleet that would carry the invasion troops for Guadalcanal began to collect in the upstream anchorages and staging points, commanders had to weigh imperfect intelligence against the political and strategic imperative to act. Ships moved under orders that were sometimes incomplete and occasionally contradictory. Admiral Turner, responsible for the landing, gripped the logistical nuts and bolts of the operation: timing, beach selection, and the fragile chain of supply that would carry men ashore and later support them. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, leading the carriers that would screen the invasion force and provide air cover, worried about the vulnerability of his carriers to land-based Japanese air power from nearby bases. Nimitz in the Central Pacific and King in Washington kept their eyes on the broader chessboard, aware that every committed carrier represented a major gamble. There were human moments amid these strategic calculations. On destroyer bridges, junior officers squinted through rain at silhouettes against the horizon and tightened bearings to keep formation. On transports, Marines shared cigarettes and last-minute private prayers. On airfields farther north, fighter pilots prepared to launch missions that might have to keep the sea lanes open long enough for Marines to build a foothold. Each small action fed the larger dynamic. The more American forces demonstrated resolve, the more Japan felt pressure to respond in force. Intelligence continued to operate as both a protective veil and a treacherous mirage.
The coast watchers who reported Japanese ship movements along the slot gave Allied commanders precious warnings that sometimes arrived too late or were incomplete. Radio intercepts and decrypts offered glimpses of Japanese intentions, but did not always reveal operational details, such as exact departure times, force composition, or tactical plans. The vast ocean, the tight deadlines, and the overlapping chains of command created an environment where missed signals could be decisive. A particularly acute vulnerability concerned night movements through the slot. Japanese cruisers and destroyers had learned to use the depths of the channel to conceal their movement until they could strike by surprise at dawn or under cover of darkness. For Allied planners, predicting when and where those movements would occur required a web of observation,
from patrol aircraft to coast watchers to intercepted radio chatter. When gaps appeared in that web, they were not always evident until it was too late. Despite these fragilities, the decision to strike at Guadalcanal, seizing the airfield and using it as a base to contest Japanese southward control, was taken with a mixture of urgency and hope. Leaders hoped a swift operation, backed by effective carrier cover, would give the Allies a forward position to disrupt Japanese logistics and deny them routes to Australia. Planners also recognized the moral and psychological need to deliver a clear offensive action after months of retreat and loss. The Doolittle Raid had shown that dramatic gestures mattered. The Guadalcanal operation aimed to be one in a different register, securing a base, not merely making a statement. As the invasion date drew near, several variables remained unresolved. The adequacy of pre-landing reconnaissance, the thoroughness of carrier screening, the capacity to supply the beachhead once established, and the Japanese propensity for rapid reinforcement by sea, an ability that would be exploited repeatedly in the months to come. Commanders on both sides recognized that this was not a single engagement, but the start of a campaign whose width and duration would be measured in months, not days. The human dimension of that uncertainty is essential to grasp. For the men on the transports, the seas were not abstract lines on a map, but the threshold to an unknown and hostile shore. For the pilots tasked with short-range air cover, fuel margins were razor-thin, and every extra sortie ate away at reserves that could not be replenished easily. For intelligence officers and coast watchers, each confirmed sighting and intercepted message could change a commander's calculus overnight. For political leaders in Tokyo and Washington, perceptions mattered as much as reality. The need to reassure publics and maintain momentum infused operational choices with non-military pressure. By mid-1942, the naval chessboard had hardened. Coral Sea had shown the lethality and limits of carrier-only confrontations. Midway loomed as a potential decisive meeting. The Solomons had emerged as a theater where control of the sea lanes and airfields could decide the fate of campaigns to the south. The Doolittle Raid, blunt and symbolic, had threaded through these developments as both symptom and stimulant. It was a symptom of a changing contest where air power reached farther and politicians measured prestige in the ability to strike at an enemy's heart. It was a stimulant that encouraged aggressive responses from Tokyo and daring plans from Washington. In the weeks before the amphibious force steamed for Guadalcanal, commanders made last-minute calculations and adjustments. Carrier task groups practiced coordinated launches and recoveries near the transports. Amphibious rehearsals tested doctrine that was still improvisational. Intelligence officers scrambled to tighten watches on Japanese movements and intercepts. Small victories and small failures accumulated. A reconnaissance report confirming an airfield half-built. A coast watcher's message suggesting troop movements that could threaten landing lanes. A failed long-range search in the slot that later would be judged regrettable in hindsight. Each piece mattered. There were micro-stories that anticipated the larger drama. A young aviator tied down his flight gear and thought of his brother far from the front. A seasoned petty officer checked the lashing on a landing craft for the second time. A codebreaker, working deep into the night, unearthed an intercepted message that hinted at Japanese plans but left critical details blank. On the bridges of warships, captains compared notes, aware that the coming days would test not only ships and aircraft, but the very systems of command and cooperation that had been hurriedly assembled across the Pacific. As the invasion fleet approached the staging points, the strategic and human pressures converged. The Japanese, stung by the Doolittle Raid and determined to regain the initiative, readied countermeasures. Their planners accelerated reinforcements and movements designed to cut off Allied advances and to reassert dominance over sea lanes that led to Australia. Allied commanders, constrained by limited carriers and stretched supply lines, prepared for an operation that would demand tenacity, tactical flexibility, and improvisation on land and at sea. The stage was set for a collision of doctrine and courage. What began as an audacious demonstration over Tokyo had rippled outward into a set of strategic imperatives and perilous choices. The men and machines converging on Guadalcanal did not yet know how ferocious the fighting would become,
nor how much the campaign would teach both sides about the limits and possibilities of carrier warfare, amphibious operations, and the endurance of professional soldiers and sailors under extreme strain.
In the final hours before the landings, tension tightened like a wire. Ships broke formation to adjust to localized weather. Last-minute reconnaissance flew out to confirm beach approaches. Commanders argued, briefly and fiercely, over time on target and carrier withdrawal schedules. The balance between necessary boldness and prudent caution was thin. One misread, one missed report, one delayed sortie could turn a carefully planned assault into a desperate scramble. And yet, for all the risks, the political imperative to act had the momentum. The Doolittle Raid, small in tonnage and material effect, had done what strategic operations are meant to do when they work beyond their physical impacts. It shifted perceptions, expanded political will, and compressed time. Tokyo felt the urgency to answer. Washington felt the urgency to seize an opportunity to seize ground and to demonstrate that America could not only strike back, but could hold ground. What neither side fully grasped then was how quickly a campaign that began with a raid and continued with gambles for carriers and islands would become a grinding test of logistics, ingenuity, and human endurance. The first flares of that grinding would be visible in the days immediately ahead, in carrier sorties launched at dawn, in destroyers skimming the slot at night, in the harsh, immediate close combat that awaited the first waves of Marines on shore. The strategic ripples had become a wave. Whether it would smash into victory or be broken on shoals of miscalculation remained to be seen. The invasion convoys slipped toward their objective under clouded nights and the hush of radio silence. On reconnaissance planes, pilots leaned forward, their faces set, searching for the low, dark shapes that might signal an approaching enemy formation. Coast watchers, where present, listened for the telltale hum of engines and sent urgent messages that might alter the balance of the coming assault. Command bridges lit with the green glow of plotting tables, maps were pored over again and again. The theater was small, the stakes vast. It was at this point, when the ships were in final approach, when carriers had set their strike cycles, and when coast watchers' reports still left critical gaps, that one of the most consequential vulnerabilities showed itself: the search of the slot. In the hours before the landings, scheduled searches failed to detect a Japanese cruiser-destroyer force making an approach through that channel. Whether through miscommunication, weather, or simply the tyranny of too much ocean to patrol, the failure to locate those enemy ships left the invasion group exposed to a night and dawn counterstroke that would test command choices and tactical improvisation in a way that textbooks had yet to explain. For the men aboard the transports and the carriers, the coming hours were a crucible of fear and duty.
For the admirals on their flagships, the decisions they made, how long to keep carriers on station, when to withdraw them, how to cross information between theaters, would shape outcomes in ways neither could fully foresee. The Doolittle Raid had changed expectations about reach and vulnerability. The upcoming operations would test whether that change would lead to strategic recalibration or to catastrophic overreach. As dawn threatened the horizon and the first landing craft readied their ramps, the ocean itself seemed to hold its breath. Commanders on both sides tightened their faces and their plans. The American endeavor to seize a foothold, to hold a forward airfield, and to blunt Japanese southward pressure was about to be measured against determined countermoves. The story that had begun with a dozen bombers over Tokyo now rushed toward a new, bloody chapter, one where small unit grit, carrier doctrine, intelligence successes and failures, and the stubbornness of sea power would determine the course of the Pacific War. At this threshold, the choices made in Tokyo and Washington, the signals missed in the slot, the moral shock delivered by the raid, and the improvisations of commanders and crews would collide. The unfolding battle would reveal which side could better adapt to the new realities of naval-air combined operations, and which could sustain the attrition of men, planes, and ships over time. The raid had been a wake-up call. The next hours and days would be the first test of whether that wakefulness could be turned into durable strategic advantage. When the first waves of landing craft nosed into the shallows and the Marines began to clamber over coral and up into a terrain that smelled of salt, rot, and crushed pandanus, the war shifted from maps to inches.
The early amphibious assault on Guadalcanal and the simultaneous strikes at Tulagi, Gavatu, and Tanambago were meant to be surgical. Seize an airfield under construction, put fighters ashore, deny the Japanese a forward base for strikes into the sea lanes to Australia. What the operation found was less tidy: improvised logistics, hostile pockets of resistance, and a set of tactical problems that the American forces had only recently begun to study. On Tulagi, the action that greeted the first assault units was fierce and immediate. Tiny harbors, rock beaches, and the low palms that ringed the island hid Japanese positions, machine guns, mortar pits, and men willing to fight to the last. The day's order of battle for the attackers was straightforward in planning and chaotic in execution. Small boats, under the protective arc of naval gunfire and carrier strikes, would deliver Marines who would then clear and secure objectives island by island.
In practice, that meant brittle fragility, landing craft grounded on unexpected reefs, direct hits from defenders who had prepared fallback positions among coconut palms, and the slow, brutal work of dislodging dug-in defenders from irregular stone walls and collapsed buildings. Gavutu and Tanambogo, two contiguous islets, barely more than rocky lumps in the harbor, presented a different, darker problem. Their defenders were determined and in many cases prepared to deny the attackers any quarter. Landing on such small, closely built targets forced Marines into confined, three-dimensional fights, combat in rock-floor drainage ditches, along narrow causeways between pools of reef, up into ruined houses and improvised bunkers. The Japanese defenders used caves and dugouts to survive naval gunfire. Then, when infantry closed, they conducted close-in counterattacks and at times engaged in desperate, often suicidal methods of defense that underscored how much the stakes meant on both sides. American forces learned, quickly and often the hard way, that clearing a cave or bunker required deliberate small-unit tactics, coordination with engineers, and sometimes the painful sacrifice of time and men. It is worth lingering on one microcosm of that struggle, not to romanticize the fight, but to understand its human dimension. A squad of Marines tasked to clear a line of caves on Tanambogo advanced with grenades, wire cutters, and a grim sense of what they might find. They moved under intermittent machine gun fire from cliff tops. They pulled bodies and ringing ears through shafts of sunlight. They listened for the slightest change in the echo of a cave that might mean an enemy movement or the collapse of rock loosened by ordnance. Elsewhere, a petty officer on a landing craft kept a steady hand at the helm, despite shrapnel singing past the bow, thinking only of keeping his men on course through a reef-laced minefield of coral. These were the scenes that, repeated thousands of times across beaches and jungle paths in the Solomons, produced the attritional learning that would shape doctrine for the rest of the war. Edson's Raiders, the Marine units under Lieutenant Colonel Merritt A. Edson, became one of the emblematic small unit stories of the campaign. Tasked with defending a ridge overlooking the airfield approaches, Edson's men held a slender line against repeated night assaults intended to eject the Americans from the newly captured strip. The Japanese counterattacks were not mere probing raids. They were determined, coordinated attempts to smash the beachhead before the Allies could install effective air cover. In the night, with rain and the red glare of tracer lighting the jungle canopy, the raiders repelled waves of infantry pressing through the mangrove and along ridgelines.
Their defense was improvisational. Staggered fields of fire, use of platoon-sized reserves were available, and, crucially, a psychological steadiness that came from training and leadership. That steadiness, more than technology or numbers, bought time for the fledgling airbase to receive critical deliveries and for reinforcements to arrive. The title of Henderson Field had not yet been stamped in the imagination of the island. For the men who fought to keep the perimeter on those early nights, the field was both a prize and a fragile hinge. Aircraft delivered into the airfield, when pilots could land on the rough strip, became a sustainable defense against Japanese land-based air. The captures of Guadalcanal and Tulagi were not ends in themselves, but catalysts. Air assets ashore extended the strike radius of Allied forces, while simultaneously making the island a tempting target for Japanese forces determined to deny the Allies that capability. Air battles above the Solomons hardened the lesson that air superiority was neither automatic nor irreversible. The Mitsubishi A6M0 remained, at that time, a superb airframe,
highly maneuverable, long-ranged, and pilot-friendly. American F-4F Wildcats, while robust and sturdier in a dive, were generally outclassed in turning contests and often outmatched by veteran Japanese pilots who employed aggressive tactics. Allied pilots adapted, however, both through training and tactical innovation. They began to emphasize energy tactics, using dives and climbs to exploit the Wildcat's strengths, rather than attempting to match the Zero in close-quarters turning fights. Over time, techniques like the thatch weave developed to counter the Zero's maneuvering, and better coordination with shipborne anti-aircraft fire improved survivability. In the early days of Guadalcanal, however, pilot shortages, fuel limitations, and the long reaches of the theater meant that every sortie had to be carefully economized. Pilots flew to the ragged margin of their operational envelopes and often returned to small, hastily built lines of aircraft maintenance that strained to keep engines serviceable amid heat and humidity. At sea, the naval situation was a two-front puzzle. On one axis, the carriers that had provided the initial air umbrella were vulnerable to land-based strikes from Japanese bases in the Bismarcks and the Solomons complex. On another axis, the narrow, treacherous slot provided a concealed avenue for Japanese cruiser-destroyer forces to punch through under darkness and threaten supply lines and beachheads. The slot's dark corridor was a tactical gift to a navy comfortable conducting night actions with well-trained destroyer crews and cruisers adept at rapid torpedo attacks and coordinated illumination. Allied commanders knew this, but could not fully compensate for it with the resources at hand. This reality produced wrenching command decisions.
Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, responsible for the carrier task forces positioned to give air cover during the first phases of the landings, faced the torment familiar to naval commanders in that era. Keep carriers on station to provide indispensable air support to troops ashore, or withdraw them to protect the very capital assets whose loss would be catastrophic for the entire theater. The Doolittle Raid had demonstrated, in a different register, that the ability to reach an enemy's home islands mattered politically and perceptually. For Allied commanders, the loss of carriers would blunt any capacity to project power beyond the Solomons, and, more immediately, would reduce options for offensive operations across the Pacific. In that calculus, Fletcher made a constrained but defensible decision to withdraw the carriers when his intelligence and assessment suggested a clear and present danger, not only from land-based aircraft, but from the possibility of a strong Japanese fleet sortie seeking to strike screens and carriers. His withdrawal, however measured, had immediate consequences. With the carriers gone, the transports and smaller ships that had delivered marines and supplies were at greater risk. Without the mobile air umbrella of fleet aviation, they relied on island-based fighters that were barely operational, and on shipborne anti-aircraft that could not substitute for patrol and interception coverage. The night actions that followed, conducted with Japanese skill in night torpedo tactics and close-range gunnery, caught the Allied forces in a dangerous posture. Japanese cruisers, exploiting darkness and local superiority in nighttime maneuver and torpedo doctrine, penetrated Allied screening lines. The result was a shock. Allied cruisers and escorts suffered a severe blow in a nocturnal engagement that demonstrated how vulnerable the western flank could be when surprise and night fighting favored the attacker. The loss of heavy units and trained crews in that action reverberated beyond the immediate damage. It imposed a costly operational pause and forced Allied commanders to rethink night screening practices, reconnaissance, and the use of radar, still a developing technology whose potential would expand in months to come. Intelligence again proved both a protector and a problem. Coast watchers, small, often isolated observers stationed on outlying islands, continued to relay sightings that allowed limited anticipation of Japanese moves. Names such as Paul Edward Mason, spelling identification indefinido, verify, appear in some accounts of these coastal reports. Regardless of individual attribution, the network of observers provided eyes where official reconnaissance could not. But a gap remained where the slot threaded through the island chain. Scheduled searches failed to detect a Japanese cruiser-destroyer force moving through the channel at night in the crucial hours.
Whether this failure was due to miscommunication, an underestimated current of risk, or simple human error, its consequence was immediate and costly. Commanders had to adapt rapidly to the reality that the enemy could and would exploit opportunities under cover of darkness. The Japanese response policy in those weeks after Doolittle and the early landings was twofold: attempt to destroy the Allied lodgment and, failing that, to deny it the reinforcement and resupply it needed to grow into a forward base. Destroyers running fast nocturnal supply and reinforcement missions, later christened by sailors as the Tokyo Express, began to shuttle troops and materiel into the Solomons under cover of night.
These runs were compact, high-risk, and placed a premium on secrecy and speed. They were also doctrinally consistent with a navy that had trained extensively in night torpedo tactics and saw in darkness a mitigating veil against Allied air power. On land, the struggle for supply and attrition took a predictable form. Henderson Field, its runways still patched and its fuel and ammunition stocks limited, became simultaneously the object of Japanese fixation and the scarce resource around American survival pivoted. If Japan could retake the airfield, the island would return to a defensive line sealing direct sea and air approaches to the south. If the Americans kept it, they would be able to interdict Japanese convoys and staging areas, making Osaka and Rabaul more tactically frail. This strategic tension encouraged relentless attacks, risky reinforcements, and a kind of attritional grinding that neither side had fully anticipated in advance. The months that followed the initial landings became a test of endurance, adaptation, and the attrition of trained human capital. Japan's losses were not merely material. Each lost veteran pilot, each battered cruiser whose crew had been decimated, represented an investment that Tokyo could not easily or quickly replace. America's industrial surge would eventually produce ships and planes in quantities Japan could not match, but in mid-1942, that advantage had not yet fully manifested. The immediate Allied advantage lay in the ability to learn quickly about night fighting, amphibious support, combined arms integration, and the effective use of intelligence, and to institutionalize those lessons under fire. One of the most consequential lessons was the role of small unit ingenuity under the stress of limited supplies. Patrols behind the lines, often made up of ad hoc groups of Marines and Army units, learned to harass Japanese supply lines, ambush nighttime reinforcement craft, and use the island's dense terrain to their defensive advantage.
Engineers and quartermasters improvised field-expedient solutions to keep aircraft flying and artillery firing. At one moment, a bulldozer might be pressed into leveling a longer stretch of runway. At another, sailors converted landing craft into makeshift supply vessels that could skirt reefs to deliver critical rations. These improvisations mattered. They salted the early successes and bled the Japanese capacity to press an immediate, overwhelming counteroffensive. As the campaign matured, the cumulative effect of the Guadalcanal operations manifested at multiple levels simultaneously. At the tactical level, Marines and soldiers, through a combination of stubborn defense and tactical refinement, held ground that had been captured with extraordinary effort. At the operational level, Allied naval and air forces, while initially surprised and sometimes beaten at night, began to incorporate radar, better nighttime screening practices, and tighter inter-service communication into their doctrine. At the strategic level, the campaign drew in Japanese assets on a scale Tokyo had not anticipated. Cruisers, destroyers, and air squadrons dedicated to attempts to eject the Allies from the islands. Those commitments, in turn, created a series of attritional drains. That attrition slowly reshaped relative capabilities. Experienced Japanese pilots, who had been among the best in the early months of the war, were exposed to intense combat over the Solomons and suffered losses that could not be quickly replaced. Japan's industrial and training capacity could not regenerate veteran air crews at the rate the war demanded. Training a pilot to the level of a battle-seasoned veteran took time and resources Japan increasingly lacked. The United States, by contrast, while suffering its own losses, had the industrial and training base to replace machines and to accelerate the training pipeline, especially as lessons from Guadalcanal and Midway filtered back to the training commands. The psychological effect of this attrition was real. Tokyo had to commit now, or see its capacity to deny Allied advances decline. Washington could afford to stretch, learn, and then expand. It is essential to return to the central interpretive thread. The Doolittle Raid was a psychological jolt that amplified pre-existing tensions and priorities. It did not cause Guadalcanal by fiat. Instead, it sharpened the urgency in Tokyo to secure a perimeter and to restore the aura of invulnerability that the home islands enjoyed before the raid. That urgency made plans like the Midway operation appear more necessary and expedited the commitment of forces to the Solomons. Simultaneously, the raid stiffened Allied resolve. In Washington and in the Pacific commands, leaders who had seen the symbolic power of small, bold actions became more willing to accept operational risk, provided it could be balanced by intelligence, surprise, and tactical innovation.
In the months after the initial landings, the campaign's human ledger filled with anecdotes that underscored the campaign's character. Sailors patched holes in hulls while convoying food, Gunners on destroyers refused sleep to man watches through endless nights. Medics set up triage sites in scrubby clearings and learned to triage topical wounds in the absence of surgical teams. Individual acts of leadership, platoon leaders reorganizing shattered formations under fire, pilots making split-second decisions that preserved a squadron's remaining aircraft, petty officers keeping landing craft serviceable under shell fragments, aggregate into the kind of systemic resilience that, in aggregate, altered the course of the war. At the same time, the campaign imposed costs that were tragic and irreversible. Men on both sides died far from the theaters of formal strategy, and the island's vegetation bore the marks of close combat for years after. The human toll cannot be reduced to strategic calculus without losing the moral frame the campaign deserves. Strategic lessons were learned only because men kept fighting, suffering, and improvising in the face of fear and exhaustion. By late 1942, Guadalcanal's strategic weight became unmistakable. The island's airfield, once in American hands, increasingly denied Japan the ability to project reliable land-based air power into the sea lanes leading south. The Tokyo Navy, forced to commit destroyers and cruisers to repeated reinforcement missions and to expose valuable pilots to attritional air combat, found its capacity to sustain simultaneous large-scale offensives eroding. For the Allies, the prolonged engagement proved a painful but productive crucible. Adaptability under fire, improved integration of naval and air assets, and a growing competence in amphibious warfare that would later serve as a foundation for island-hopping campaigns across the Central and Western Pacific. The Doolittle Raid's symbolic import continued to echo. It had punctured an assumption of invulnerability and injected an element of strategic paranoia into Tokyo's planning. That paranoia, in turn, pushed Japanese planners towards operations that sought decisive engagements, operations like the planned Midway Trap that would either reassert dominance or risk catastrophic overreach. Midway, Coral Sea, and Guadalcanal thus form a chain in which psychological shock, intelligence action, and material confrontation converge. The raid's role was catalytic, not as the single cause, but as an accelerant of decisions that might otherwise have been tempered by time. Evaluating the campaign's aftermath requires a careful balance between praise for American resilience and recognition of the severe costs paid. Guadalcanal was not a simple victory. It was a grinding, bitter campaign that forced both sides to learn hard lessons about the new mechanics of naval air warfare and the logistics of amphibious operations in a coral and jungle environment.
The Allies' ability to learn and to sustain operations across months denied the Japanese the chance to re-establish a secure perimeter. Over time, the cumulative effect of that denial, the erosion of Japan's capacity to deny sea and air control in critical sectors, helped tip strategic initiative toward the Allies. There are, in the historical record, ambiguities and contested claims that must be navigated with care. Some names, dates, and attributions remain the subject of archival verification. For example, references to specific Coast Watcher reports or individuals, some accounts cite a Paul Edward Mason, spelling identification indefinito, verify, require cross-checking with primary sources before being asserted in academic detail. Similarly, personnel cited in oral histories, like Gunnery Sergeant Angus Goss, identification indefinito, verify, deserve verification of spelling and service record before they are presented as definitive. These points of uncertainty do not undercut the broader narrative. Rather, they show the necessity of careful archival work in reconstructing complex campaigns from fragmentary or imperfect documents. The larger strategic lesson remains clear. Small, bold operations can have outsized psychological and political effects that alter adversary perceptions and force decisions with far-reaching consequences. The Doolittle Raid's daring over Tokyo reverberated in Tokyo's war rooms and in Washington's briefings alike. It helped create a climate in which risk-seeking plans, like luring the U.S. fleet into battle at Midway, were accelerated, and in which the Solomons rose from local geography to strategic fulcrum. Guadalcanal, Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo became not only the sites of tactical contest, but the places where naval doctrine, air doctrine, and amphibious practice were forged through blood, ingenuity, and stubborn endurance. In the end, the campaign's legacy is twofold. Operationally, it rewrote parts of naval and air doctrine. It forced faster adoption of radar, better night screening, tighter inter-service liaison, and improved amphibious logistics.
Strategically, it contributed to a shift in initiative in the Pacific, a long, grinding shift that would not be decided by one battle, one raid, or one admiral's decision, but through cumulative pressure, loss, learning, and industrial recuperation. The Doolittle Raid matters in that chain because it was a visible, politically potent signal that helped accelerate choices in Tokyo and embolden planners in Washington. Guadalcanal matters because it was the place where that signal met material reality and where American resilience, hard-earned and painfully refined, began to translate into sustained strategic advantage. As historians, the temptation is sometimes to find a single pivot point and hang everything on it. History rarely offers such neat fulcrums.
The campaign that threaded from Doolittle to Guadalcanal is instead a braided narrative. Shock, reaction, intelligence, friction, improvisation, and human courage braided into outcomes that could not have been guaranteed in advance. In that braid, both decisions in distant strategy rooms and the small acts of courage on a reef or ridge mattered. The Pacific War's momentum shifted not because of inevitability, but because adaptation and endurance stacked advantage over time. If you want to dig deeper into the threads that braided the Pacific campaign, how code-breaking shaped decisions at Midway, how carrier doctrine evolved in the months after Coral Sea, or how night fighting and radar would change naval warfare, there are primary sources and first-hand accounts that illuminate the mechanics and the human stories. For a close study of Midway's tactical interplay with the Doolittle Raid's political consequences, our next episode will examine how intelligence, deception, and command choices met in that decisive encounter. Finally, reflect on what Guadalcanal and the chain of events beginning with Doolittle reveal about warfare in the modern age. That perception can be as consequential as tonnage, that adaptation under stress is as vital as industrial output, and that the courage and suffering of individuals in small places can collectively shape the destinies of nations. If this examination moved you, consult primary diaries, operational orders, and after-action reports to see how granular decisions stacked into strategy. And when you're ready, join the next installment, where we follow the trail from the Solomons back to Midway and see how carrier warfare itself was forever transformed by these fierce months of 1942.